Hello, oceanography students. So in the previous video, you learned about different types of phytoplankton, which are planktonic organisms that are able to photosynthesize. And in this video, we're going to learn a little bit about the factors that affect how quickly they grow and reproduce. In other words, what factors are the main factors affecting primary production in the ocean. Okay. So the main factors affecting phytoplankton growth and reproduction are, one is nutrients, and the main nutrients that we're going to focus on are nitrogen and phosphorus. Iron, silicon, calcium are important as well, as we've already learned. Okay, so if nutrients are important, then how do we get nutrients into the water? Where do they come from? One way is that they are supplied from land by way of runoff. So nutrients on land get washed away into the ocean and put the nutrients into the ocean. Cold water also supplies a lot of nutrients because it is able to contain more of those nutrients because they're more soluble in cold water. And then also areas of upwelling are higher nutrient concentration because upwelling brings water from deep down up to the surface. That water that's deep down is water that essentially dead organisms have sunk down to, and their bodies have nutrients trapped in them, and therefore when that water is brought back up, it's full of nutrients as well. Okay, so where are we going to find high nutrient environments? We're going to find high nutrient environments around land. We're going to find high nutrient environments around cold water, and we're going to find high nutrient environments in areas of upwelling. Okay, so this is showing us the cycling of phosphorus in the ocean and also on land. Okay, so a lot of phosphorus comes off of land and washes into the ocean or washes into lakes and different waterways. Once it's there, it's taken up by phytoplankton and algae and other photosynthesizers, and it's used to build their tissues. Then other organisms eat those photosynthetic organisms, which are autotrophs, right? Other organisms eat them, and then the phosphorus goes into those other organisms. Those other organisms get eaten by other things, and so on and so forth, and so the phosphorus basically gets passed around. Additionally, some of the phosphorus is excreted as waste and feces. So basically, the poop settles down to the bottom, and it can be brought back up to the surface by way of upwelling. And sometimes organisms that live in the ocean are actually eaten by organisms on land. So here we see an eagle or an osprey that is taking a fish from the water and bringing it to land to eat it. Once it does eat it, some of that phosphorus goes into that animal. Some of it is put back into the sediment as poop, and other of it is actually in the carcass of the organism. So then you have the phosphorus on land. That phosphorus essentially goes into the nutrients for plants on land, and then other organisms that eat plants on land eat that. They also poop, and so all of this phosphorus that came onto land ends up coming back into the ocean. I shouldn't say all of it, but a lot of it ends up coming back into the ocean by way of runoff. Okay. Of course, you can also have it coming from uplift when you have convergent zones, and some of it gets put into the sediment, and it gets brought back up by way of autotrophic organisms on land. Now, the nitrogen cycle is similar, except that remember that we first have to rely on bacteria and archaea in order to take the nitrogen in a non-bioavailable form and turn it into a bioavailable form. So that first step in getting the nitrogen from the atmosphere into a bioavailable form, or fixing it, happens by way of bacteria, and then once it's in a bioavailable form, then it follows basically the same pattern as the phosphorus cycle does. Okay. The second factor that affects the phytoplankton growth and reproduction is solar radiation. So sunlight only penetrates into the water to the bottom of the euphotic zone. Okay? Therefore, the only place that photosynthesis is going to be occurring is the euphotic zone. And the compensation depth for photosynthesis is the depth at which the net photosynthesis is 0. Therefore, the compensation depth for photosynthesis would be at the very bottom of the euphotic zone. Okay, so here we have a body of water, and as you go down, the depth increases down to 100 meters depth. And what we're looking at here is an energy spectrum. Okay, so you have cosmic rays, gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet rays, visible radiation, infrared radiation, microwaves, TV, UHF, etc., all the way down to very long wavelength energy. So the smaller wavelength over here, the longer wavelengths over here. Now for photosynthesis, photosynthesis occurs in the visible spectrum, or by way of the visible spectrum. The visible spectrum is also broken down into wavelengths. That's why we have violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red wavelengths. So as the sun penetrates onto the ocean, some of those wavelengths are absorbed, and some of them are able to transfer all the way down to 100 meters or more in depth. Okay, so again, light doesn't penetrate to great depths in the ocean. In the clearest waters, light can penetrate to 1,000 meters. Red light only goes down to about 10 meters, yellow light only to about 100 meters, and blue light penetrates the deepest. This is why our water appears to be blue. Okay, now in this image here, we're looking at a column of water, and we're seeing that we have the euphotic zone up here, we have the dysphotic zone here, and then we have the aphotic zone. So notice that the euphotic zone is only in the upper surface of the water. Therefore, organisms that are photosynthetic need to stay in that area. So that means that phytoplankton need to be able to float, and therefore they actually have different mechanisms that allow them to stay up at the surface rather than sink down, such as an oil droplet or the protrusions from their shells. Okay, so phytoplankton must be able to float. Now the depth, the compensation depth for photosynthesis depends on basically how murky the water is. And this is something that we've talked about a little bit in lab, and that basically this is showing you how far light will penetrate, how far the euphotic zone goes in clear open ocean water. Clear means that there's not a lot of particles in it to absorb the light, and therefore the light is able to transfer all the way down to 600 meters depth. Whereas over here, this is an example of a coastal ocean environment where you have a lot of sediment in the water, you have a lot of particles in the water, and therefore the light is absorbed more quickly and cannot penetrate as deep. So in this example, the euphotic zone only goes to 100 meters depth. Okay, so the depth of photosynthesis, how deep down photosynthetic organisms can live, very much depends on the clarity of the water. Okay, so how do nutrient concentrations and solar radiation actually affect productivity in our oceans? In this map here, we're looking at chlorophyll concentrations. Why would we look at chlorophyll concentrations when we're talking about primary production? Well, because all organisms that are photosynthetic contain chlorophyll. Therefore, the amount of chlorophyll in an area tells you how many photosynthetic organisms there are there. So in this image, we're looking at this legend right here. So the purple would be very low amounts of chlorophyll, and the red would be very high amounts of chlorophyll. This legend over here is for land. Okay, so we're just going to pay attention to the ocean. So look at the map and tell me, or think to yourself, since you can't tell me, where are you finding the greatest amounts of photosynthesis as measured by chlorophyll concentration? So you may have noticed this red right here, but you may have also noticed all of this green up here in the northern hemisphere around the Arctic. Essentially, this image was probably taken in the northern hemisphere summer, because that's when there's enough sunlight to support photosynthesis up here. All right, so that's why it's so green. Additionally, the water there is very cold. Okay, so we have cold water, which means lots of nutrients, and in the summertime we have sunlight, which means that you can have a lot of photosynthetic organisms growing and reproducing there. Where you don't see very much is in the center of those subtropical gyres. Remember the subtropical gyres? Subtropical gyres are areas where waters are converging, and where waters are converging, you don't have upwelling, instead you have downwelling and you have very low nutrient concentrations. There is a little bit of increased productivity along the equator because this is an area where waters are diverging and that creates upwelling. Additionally, remember we've talked a little bit about Peru and the upwelling that's along the coast there. That naturally happens in an El Nino. The opposite happens and it's not high productivity, right? So in normal conditions, we have high productivity here, and that's why you can see this bright yellow color. Okay, so compare that to sea surface temperatures, and we should see that in places where the water is colder, generally speaking, we have higher productivity than in places where the water is warmer. Okay. This table here is showing you, based on different ecosystems, what the primary productivity is there. So the highest primary productivity in our oceans occurs in algae beds and coral reefs. And so we'll actually talk about those next week. Then estuaries are also productive environments because estuaries are semi-enclosed by land, which means that there is high nutrient input in estuaries as well. Then we have upwelling zones, and again, upwelling zones mean that you're bringing a lot of nutrients into the surface waters where they can be used by phytoplankton and other photosynthetic organisms. Then you have the continental shelf, which means it's closer to land. The open ocean is the least productive because it is the lowest in nutrient concentrations. Okay. So nutrients and sunlight are the main factors affecting primary production. So the amount of primary production in a given region is going to depend on nutrient concentration in the water and how much sunlight that region gets. Okay, so how much nutrients are there and how much sunlight is there? Okay, high amount of nutrients and high amount of sunlight means high amount of primary production. And again, primary production is the rate of growth and reproduction of photosynthetic organisms. Okay, now the amount of nutrients and sunlight in the surface waters can change seasonally, of course, and additionally, you can have too much sunlight. If you have too much sunlight, what happens is that surface water ends up warming, and you have a thermocline that gets created. Remember, the thermocline is a drastically changing temperature with depth. And that thermocline acts as a barrier, which means that the water column there is stable and you're not going to have vertical mixing, which means you're not going to have a lot of upwelling, or in other words, you're not going to have nutrients being brought back up to the surface. Okay, the only way that an area that has a lot of sunlight will have a lot of nutrients in the surface water is if it's near land or there is upwelling going on for other reasons other than temperature reasons. Okay, so if we look at 3 different environments, we can see that we can compare the primary productivity in those 3 environments in the ocean. Okay, so this graph is showing us phytoplankton biomass, which is a measure of primary productivity, over the course of a year in 3 different locations: tropical waters, the northern temperate waters, and the polar waters. Okay, so we can already see here the tropical waters is this line down here. That is much lower in primary productivity than the northern temperate waters are over the whole course of the year. But according to the northern polar waters, the tropics are slightly higher in productivity at certain times of the year and much lower at this time of the year, which is the northern hemisphere summer. Okay, so additionally, the tropics don't change seasonally. They stay the same the whole time, whereas northern temperate waters, they have they have a low amount of productivity, then they have a higher amount, then a lower amount, then a higher amount, and then a lower amount. So we basically see 4 changes in primary production, which match up with the 4 seasons. For the northern polar waters, it's basically no primary production during most of the year, except for in the summer when they have this drastic increase in primary production that is actually greater than the peaks in the northern temperate waters as well. So let's start out by talking about the polar oceans and why we see that pattern of very low productivity over the course of the year and then very high productivity over the summertime. The reason why is that, remember that the Earth is tilted, and so at certain times the North Pole is getting lots of sunlight, 24 hours of sunlight in fact, and at other times the North Pole is getting no sunlight whatsoever. Okay, so what we would say is that primary production in polar oceans is limited by sunlight. Okay, in polar oceans there are plenty of nutrients, as can be seen from this graph here. This graph is showing us temperature on the x-axis and the y-axis is depth. So as we go down from the surface down in depth, we see that the temperature doesn't really change. That indicates to us that this is an unstable water column, meaning that deeper water can mix with surface waters, which means that nutrients can constantly be circulating in the waters. So polar ocean waters are very high in nutrient concentrations. However, they tend to be low in the amount of sunlight or solar radiation, except for in the summertime. So from about June, July, and August, we see this drastic peak in phytoplankton biomass, and that's because there are constantly lots of nutrients in the water. And so they're just waiting for sunlight to come around so that they can start photosynthesizing and growing and reproducing. And so once that sun comes in, they are able to grow rapidly, okay, until the sun goes away again. All right, so again, remember that our Earth is tilted, and therefore as we orbit the sun, sometimes the sun is directed at the southern hemisphere, and sometimes the sun is directed at the northern hemisphere, and other times the sun is just directed right at the equator. Okay, so that is going to affect the seasonality of primary productivity in pretty much all of the world's oceans. Here is summer chlorophyll concentrations, and we can see that, and I should say summer, northern hemisphere summer, and we can see that up here, these are higher amounts of chlorophyll concentration, and down here this is lower amounts. So if you look at the northern polar waters, they are red, which means that they are very high in productivity in the summertime, and higher than pretty much anywhere else other than places along land. Places along land constantly have nutrient supplies, and therefore that's why they are so high in productivity. Okay, next let's talk about the tropics and why the tropics are low and why the tropics don't tend to change seasonally. So in tropical waters, there is a constant supply of sunlight, right? The sun is always hitting the tropics. And when I say tropics, I'm pretty much saying 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south, about around that, okay? So if we have constant sunlight hitting the water, that's going to warm up the water, okay? So when that water warms up, then as you get down into deeper water, it gets drastically colder. So we have low density water sitting up here on top of higher density water. What that means is that we're not going to have a lot of circulation between cold, nutrient-rich deep waters and surface waters. And in order for the nutrients to be used, they have to be in the surface waters because that's where photosynthetic organisms live, which is in the sunlight. Okay, so therefore the tropics are going to have a low primary productivity over the entire course of the year because they don't see a change in the amount of sunlight over the course of the year. And because of that, because there's constant warming of the surface water that creates that thermocline, it is very low in nutrient concentration. So although there's a lot of sunlight, there's not very much nutrients, and that's why primary productivity in tropical oceans is generally low. And when I say tropical oceans, I'm not talking about near land. If it's near land, then you have a constant input of nutrients from the land. I'm talking more about open waters here. Okay, and finally, let's talk about primary productivity in temperate waters, which is this line right here. All right. So in temperate oceans, we see changes seasonally in primary productivity, and that is due to both changes in the amount of nutrients in the surface water and changes in the amount of sunlight. So in these little squares, they are showing you a column of water in the temperate oceans away from land in the wintertime, in the springtime, in the summertime, and in the fall. The little light blue dots represent the number of phytoplankton in the water. The red line represents the depth of the sunlight penetrating down for photosynthesis. And the black line represents the temperature of the water. Okay, and then of course you have the angle of the sun up here. So we start with winter. We see that in the winter time, the sunlight is not hitting very directly, and therefore a lot of it is reflected. And so the sun doesn't penetrate very deep. It's very shallow. So in the winter time, there's not a lot of solar radiation. There are a lot of nutrients in the water, as can be shown by the fact that the temperature of the surface water is pretty similar to the temperature of deeper water, which means that there can be circulation of nutrients into the surface waters. So in the winter, although there are enough nutrients in the surface waters, there's not enough sunlight. So this is sort of similar to the poles, but not as extreme as the poles. Okay, so in the winter time, it's limited by sunlight. Now then, in the spring, the sun starts to hit more directly, and therefore, phytoplankton, because there was lots of nutrients in the surface water from the winter time, phytoplankton now have lots of nutrients in the water, and they're getting lots of sunlight, and so they can rapidly grow and reproduce. Therefore, in the spring, we say that there is a spring bloom of phytoplankton, or a spring bloom of primary productivity. Then as we go on to the next season, which is summer, the sun is hitting very directly. The sun is hitting so directly that is warming the surface waters. Therefore, that creates a very strong thermocline. So we have very warm water at the surface and cold water down deep, which the thermocline acts as a barrier. And so the cold, nutrient-rich waters cannot get up into the surface waters where they're needed anymore. So essentially, all of those nutrients get used up by all of the phytoplankton that were in the water from the spring, and then they don't get replenished because of the strong thermocline that was created by the sunlight. So in the springtime, although there's a lot of sunlight, there are not a lot of nutrients in the surface waters, and therefore primary productivity is decreased. Sort of similar to what happens in the tropics, but again, not as extreme. And then finally, when we come around to the fall, the sun is hitting at less of an angle, so that surface water can cool, and some of the nutrients can start to circulate back into the surface waters. Therefore, the phytoplankton that remain there start to get some nutrients, and therefore they can grow and reproduce. So in the fall, there's another bloom. That bloom in the fall is not as extreme as it was in the spring, because in the springtime there were tons of nutrients in the surface water and they were just waiting for the sunlight to come out. Whereas in the fall, there aren't very many nutrients, and the sun is basically just going away. Okay? So this graph here is showing you essentially the same thing, but all in the same graph. Okay? So we have an increase on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have months. So it's over the course of the year. The orange line represents the amount of sunlight. The blue line represents the amount of nutrients in the water. The green line represents the amount of phytoplankton in the water. And then the turquoise line represents the amount of zooplankton in the water. Okay, so I'll talk about zooplankton in just a second. But I want to point out that we have low amounts of sunlight in the wintertime in temperate oceans. Then we have high amounts of sunlight in the summertime. Then, at the same time, the nutrient concentration is high when the sunlight is low, and it is low when the sunlight is high. So they have basically an inverse relationship. Too much sunlight means low nutrients. Low amounts of sunlight means high nutrients, okay? And so the phytoplankton are going to be able to grow and reproduce when there's just the right combination of sunlight and nutrients, like right here and again over here. Okay, the zooplankton eat phytoplankton, and therefore they end up having blooms or peaks in their population just after the phytoplankton peak, because the zooplankton are essentially growing and reproduce in response to how much food they have. So zooplankton peak just after the phytoplankton, and then they drop off just after phytoplankton drop off as well. Okay, and so this is showing you spring chlorophyll concentrations, and we can see that in the temperate waters, we have a great increase in primary production in the open waters. So across the world, and also just to summarize, world productivity correlates with phytoplankton biomass and chlorophyll concentrations. In the poles, we see high productivity in the summertime. The tropics tends to be an ocean desert, meaning that there is not a lot of productivity in the tropics except for close to land. And then in temperate oceans, away from land, again, we see high production during bloom. So again, that happens in the spring and in the fall. Then we also see high amounts of productivity in coastal waters, so close to land where you get constant supply of nutrients, and also along upwelling zones, including the equatorial upwelling zone, which we went over back in the wind-driven circulation lecture. Okay, and in response to this high amount of phytoplankton biomass, we end up having blooms of zooplankton. When there are blooms of zooplankton, we get larger vertebrates migrating to eat those zooplankton as well. And so we see seasonal migrations of large vertebrates such as whales, such as sea turtles, and such as seabirds as well. Okay, so this movement of biomass can be depicted by showing the carbon cycle, because essentially all living things contain carbon, and photosynthetic organisms take the carbon and carbon dioxide and turn it into the carbon that's found in sugar and in their cells. Okay, and so once those get eaten, that gets transferred to other organisms, and other organisms defecate or they get eaten, and that gets transferred to other organisms or to the water column, where it is brought back up to the surface and mixed. So carbon is the basic building block of all life. All organisms contain carbon. Phytoplankton are able to fix the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere and dissolved into the ocean into organic molecules. They use that carbon for food and for structure for themselves. By food, I mean as energy. Okay? When eaten, that carbon can be used by other organisms for growth. It's also used for energy. In other words, it's breathed back out as carbon dioxide, and it can also be excreted as waste. Phytoplankton populations have declined by about 40% since 1950. Now that's a big deal because phytoplankton are at the base of the food web, and therefore if there is less fixing of carbon dioxide by phytoplankton, that means that there's yet less carbon to be transferred from one level of feeding to the next level of feeding. So if phytoplankton have declined, then that means that other populations are likely to decline as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next video. Okay, if you have any questions, please post them under the weekly discussion. Thank you.